She gave us the sunny Anne of Green Gables. But the real Lucy Maud Montgomery may surprise you.
She was lonely and on her own a lot.
She felt emotionally she was an orphan.
She created a character who got everything she needed and really didn't get in her own life.
And welcome. I'm Anne-Marie MacDonald. Last night, a lot of you may have watched Anne of Green Gables, the continuing story. Anne is one of our biggest national treasures, right up there with hockey. So tonight we bring you a special encore of the life and times of Lucy Maud Montgomery. Like her most famous creation, Montgomery was born and raised in PEI. She even grew up in a green-gabled house. But when her wit wasn't heartwarming, it was wicked. As you'll see in tonight's show, the author's life was far from a storybook.
That's the very tragic part of Lucy Maud, is that she created a character that was very liberated, and yet she was very much a victim of the structure of her time.
She keeps on writing the journal about smiling even though she's feeling rotten, she's feeling bored, she's feeling angry, and that is repressed, so that we present this nice exterior face.
She was a jolly person, I remember. She and my mother would be reminiscing over years gone by, perhaps old courtships, and some comical things had taken place years ago. Well, they'd laugh their heads off. You could almost see those walls vibrating.
She wants to be the heroine of her own life, but she doesn't realize that I think in a sense she's the villain as well.
Lucy Maud Montgomery couldn't remember a time she wasn't writing. Writing was her passion, her refuge, and her escape. Before her life was over, she would write 23 books, over 1,000 short stories and poems. Montgomery is considered one of Canada's leading cultural exports. Her work has been translated into 20 languages and turned into hundreds of stage plays and films around the world. Her most famous creation, Anne of Green Gables.
Which would you rather be if you had the choice? Divinely beautiful, or dazzlingly clever, or angelically good?
Although her character, Anne, is known far and wide, for more than a century after her birth, Montgomery herself, perhaps more than any other Canadian author, remains something of a mystery. Lucy Maud Montgomery was born in the little village of Clifton, Prince Edward Island in 1874. Before Maud is 2 years old, her young mother, Clara, dies of tuberculosis. Although Maud is too young to remember, the loss would shape her life. She would live with and write from that emptiness always. After her mother's death, her father leaves Maud with her aging grandparents in their Cavendish home. She will see him only once more during her life. Maud will be 35 years old before she's free to leave this house.
She doesn't paint it as a happy childhood. It's hard to know now how happy it was because she depicts childhood in such happy ways in her books, but she says that it was very lonely. Very, very lonely because her grandparents were too old to understand. They'd brought up their own children. They didn't really want to be bothered with this small child, very sensitive, who was in their midst, and they didn't know what to do with her. So she was lonely and on her own a lot.
And she was being raised in a very strict Victorian atmosphere where there was very little understanding or respect for children. It must have been extremely hard and cold.
Perhaps it was this loneliness that compelled Maud to invent a world of happy childhoods in loving communities.
Some might think my childhood dull, but life never held for me a dull moment. I had in my vivid imagination a passport to the geography of fairyland. In a twinkling I could and did whisk myself into regions of wonderful adventures, unhampered by any restrictions of time or place.
Whether from isolation or from a childhood rich in the pleasures of place, Lucy Maud Montgomery came to create the endearing and spunky Anne of Green Gables, the young girl who continues to hold hearts all over the world. From stage plays to animation, all around the globe, people are captivated.
Well, I had a fabulous time playing that role because I think she is an amazing character, and I don't perceive her as a saccharine character, as a sweet little girl. And I think that's what was amazing about her, and that was what was amazing about her in her time, was that she was actually a human being, and that Lucy Maud Montgomery allowed a child to have a voice that was of equal importance to the grown-ups around her. So consequently, she has a very bad temper.
Miss Cuthbert is not here.
What do you mean she's not here?
She's gone to East Grafton. And this isn't a novel, it's Virgil's Aeneid, if you want to know. And I'd rather have red hair than none at all, except a little fringe around my ears.
She can't stop talking. She's a compulsive talker. And she's a compulsive talker because she's desperately lonely. And she's had no validation in her life. And she's created a complete world around her to support her.
That's the house.
Why, it has gables. What do you call it?
Oh, just the house.
What would you think if I gave it a new name? Something that would sound more euphonious. Now, let me see. Gables, and they're green. Green Gables.
The fictional world Montgomery created close to 100 years ago lives on in Green Gables today. Each year, thousands of tourists, young and old, flock to the shrine to live the fantasy once more.
Very interesting.
Oh, I know, I read it when I was a kid.
Beautiful, beautiful. I don't know how any other words to describe it.
She was just a lovely person. I remember her quite well. She was quite jolly. She laughed a lot.
もうとてもね、すごく喜びがこう表現できてて、で、いつもしててノートを引っ掛けてて、で、思いつくと、なんかブツブツブツブツ一人で喋りながら、思いつくと書き留めて。
I grew up in New Brunswick. You were like at the end of the earth. Nothing ever happened here. Nobody came from here. This was nowhere. And in the midst of it all, there was this woman who was world famous for writing about exactly this place.
The road to fame did not come easily for L.M. Montgomery. Tragedy followed her throughout her life. Her mother's death, her absent father, a childhood closeted with rigid grandparents. But the most painful thing of all was the lack of support for her primary passion, writing.
I believed in myself, and I struggled alone, always alone, in secrecy and silence. I never told my ambitions and efforts and failures to anyone. I listened, unmoved, to the sneers and ridicule of various relatives who thought my scribbling rank folly and waste of time. That never disturbed me at all. Down, deep down, under all discouragement and rebuff, I knew I would arrive someday.
When Maud is 16, a long-awaited letter arrives from her father. He writes to tell her he has stopped his wandering, has settled out west, and wants Maud to join him and his new bride. This is the letter Maud has been wishing for since he abandoned her 14 years earlier. Finally, she'll be part of a family in her father's house in Prince Albert. She'll be an orphan no more. The year is 1890, and the railway has just been built. With high hopes and a full heart, the young Maud heads west towards a new life.
It was horrible, she said, and I certainly believe her on this, that her stepmother treated her like a servant because I think she found her a nuisance. And I think she was probably jealous of the attention that Maud's father gave to Maud. So she wanted her out of the way. And she wanted her to take care of the baby, and she wanted her to scrub the floors, and she wanted her... And Maud had other things on her mind. She wanted to have a life of her own.
If you go through the journals, you'll never find an unkind word about this man. He was a saint. But really, he gave her away. He didn't want her. I think her relationship with her father was disastrous. Why? I mean, technically, Maud Montgomery wasn't an orphan at all, but all she wrote about orphans, one orphan after another. And I think that comes from the fact that her father gave her away, and she felt emotionally she was an orphan.
My dear parents were rich and aristocratic.
Now, just the facts, mind.
My parents were poor as church mice. That's what Mrs. Thomas said.
Who is Mrs. Thomas?
She's the lady who took me when my mother died of fever when I was 3 months old. I do wish she'd lived long enough for me to remember calling her mother. It's so sweet to say mother. Don't you think? My father died of fever 4 days after. That left me an orphan.
After 1 year, Maud buries her dream of being part of a family and heads back to PEI. Back to a gray life with her grandparents, back to lights out at 9. She would never see her father again. She finds solace in her writing and in her beloved island, which she calls by its ancient name, Abergwait.
Peace. You never know what peace is until you walk along the shores, or in the fields, or along the winding red roads of Abergwait on a summer twilight, when the dew is falling, and the old stars are peeping out, and the sea keeps its nightly tryst with the little land it loves. You find your soul then, and you look around in the dimming landscape of haunted hills, and long white sand beaches, and murmuring ocean, on homestead lights, and the old fields tilled by dead and gone generations. Even if you are not Abergwait born, you will say why I have come home.
After leaving college, Montgomery teaches for a couple of years in rural schools around Prince Edward Island. But she has to give up her short career and return to Cavendish to care for her aging grandmother. After the brief but delightful taste of independence, Maud does not want to return. But she answers the call and in true Montgomery style teases out the silver lining. Maud had been writing short stories and poems since she was a young girl. To her delight and amazement, the work was selling and she was beginning to earn a living from her pen. Now, in the creeping quiet of Cavendish, she can devote herself to her writing full-time. When she's 31 years old, she begins the novel that will launch her career.
I had always kept a book in which I jotted down as they occurred to me plots, incidents, characters, and descriptions. I found a faded entry that was written many years earlier, and it said, "Elderly couple apply to orphan asylum for a boy. By mistake, a girl has sent them."
No boy, but there must be a boy. We sent word to Mrs. Spencer to bring us a boy.
Well, she didn't bring a boy. She brought her. I asked the station master.
Well, this is a pretty piece of business.
You don't want me. You don't want me because I'm not a boy. It's all too wonderful to last. I'd have known nobody really did want me.
I did not for a moment dream that the book I had just begun was to bring me the fame and success I had long dreamed of, so I wrote the opening paragraphs quite easily, not feeling obliged to write up in any particular reputation or style.
She completes the manuscript with ease and sends it out to publishers across the country. Because she and her grandmother operate the post office, Maud is the first one to check the mailbag each day, the first one to read the rejection letters. She loses heart and tries to hide her disappointment.
She had actually given up on the manuscript, and she'd put it in a hat box and put it in her closet. And when she was spring cleaning, she ran across it, sat down, she said, on the floor and started to read through a few pages. She said, "Oh, this is good." Read through the whole thing and said, "That's good. I'm going to send that off again." And she did.
After many frustrating months, she finally sends the manuscript to an American publisher, L.C. Page. Her journal entry for June 20th, 1908.
Today has been, as Anne herself would say, an epic in my life. My book came, fresh from the publishers, There in my hand lay the material realization of all the dreams and hopes and ambitions and struggles of my whole conscious existence.
The publication was without a doubt the high point of Montgomery's life, and the money started pouring in. In 1910, when the average yearly wage for women was $300, she received $7,000 in royalties. But despite the success, despite the millions of copies sold in 20 languages, Montgomery received little attention from the literary world.
Lucy Maud Montgomery was a woman writer, and that's never very easy. Many, many famous women writers have called themselves George Eliot or George Sand or, taking male names. She also wrote books for children, and that was the second downer as far as the academic people were concerned. And she was enormously popular, an enormous worldwide bestseller, as most academic people were not. So jealousy entered into the evaluation of her, and she was under-evaluated for many, many years, but adored and bought.
In the novels and stories, she composes scenes in a very different way than she does in the photographs.
Betsy Epperly read Anne of Green Gables when she was 3 years old, sitting on her daddy's knee in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. Her fascination with the story eventually led her to Prince Edward Island. Today, she's president of the university and head of the L.M. Montgomery Institute. Each year, she organizes an international symposium dedicated to the work of the island's favorite daughter. For decades, when people thought about Montgomery, they generally thought about Green Gables. They saw the writer through the rose-colored lens of Anne's world. But all that changed in 1985 with the publication of Montgomery's first journals, a detailed memoir of thousands of pages spanning 50 years, from which a very different Maud emerges to shatter the popular image. Montgomery's official biographer, Mary Rubio, is the editor of the journals. She and Epperly, like other Montgomery enthusiasts, are thrilled that these newly released journals finally bring the writer the academic attention she has been so long denied.
If Montgomery was here today, watching the conference, watching all these academics discussing her work and trying to understand it, she would be delighted. At last she's been given her due and her recognition. She's a great Canadian writer.
The revelations in the journals give scholars something to sink their teeth into. The mystery of unraveling the real L.M. Montgomery. Is she the cheerful spirit behind Anne, or the darker spirit painfully recorded in her journals? They pore over every last line of her writing and examine the hundreds of photographs she took throughout her life. The journals are critical, dark, and personal, and yet she said she'd put a hex on her family if they didn't publish them. Perhaps Maud wanted the world to know this darker side she had hidden all her life. Perhaps she wanted to shatter her own well-crafted image of the light-hearted heroine behind the cheerful children's stories. In the pages of her journals, she gives free vent to all the feelings she couldn't express in her daily life.
That was disappointing. As a matter of fact, when I saw them first, I cried. I felt so badly, because it wasn't the Aunt Maud that we loved and just looked forward to seeing.
It is always foolish to argue with a woman of Aunt Emily's type. She is as narrow-minded and merciless. He is a most ignorant, uncouth man, lacking little. Nothing has the slightest influence on her. One might as well talk to a pillar of granite. She is the most tyrannical creature who could be imagined. She must have her own way in everything.
There are passages which, to me, are very much from the heart, and very much express her bitterness and her rage. So that rage, that pus, goes into her journals. I mean, I like that. It takes guts to write that. And it takes guts to leave it in. I mean, we don't know what she cut out, which might be even more pussy.
She mentions in the journals that she had taken Veronal, and I understand that is sort of a sedative or something to, what is the word I'm looking for?
Calm.
Yeah. And so I think that is when she wrote some of those journals, when she was depressed and that. And I don't think she wasn't the Aunt Maud that we knew.
Of all the facets of this woman's life exposed for the first time in the journals, the most difficult to accept was her vibrant sexuality. This revelation both titillated and disquieted her loyal followers.
I wasn't expecting her to be such a sexual being at all, and that was a real shock. I wasn't expecting her to be such a flirt, and that was a shock. And I wasn't expecting her to be so neurotic. I think, we when those journals came out, we looked at them thinking, here's the autobiography of Anne of Green Gables, and you read it for that, and that's certainly there, or aspects of that are there, but there's just all the other stuff.
Lucy Maud Montgomery was a flirt. I've heard that Lucy Maud Montgomery was a flirt. She characterizes herself as a flirt. Look at what she says in her early years in the early journals. I certainly think she was a flirt, and I think she was a very proficient flirt, too. I mean, she was really good at it.
Men, did you say? Yeah. Well, I guess she did. She had a lot of admirers.
One after another, she goes out with these poor guys. She runs the roads with them. She goes to dances with them. She goes to church with them. And then, inevitably, when they propose, and they all seemingly seem to propose, she says no. And either they're not suitable, or she doesn't have no idea where they got the idea that she was serious.
During the winter when I was at Prince of Wales, I went around with Lem, but it was John Sutherland I was in love with. I was hand in glove with Willie Pritchard. I liked Willie. I'm quite sure. If he had kissed me again at that moment, not all the resolution in the world could have prevented me from betraying my repugnance.
This is just hearsay, but there's one especially. She said that she would go to her grave loving him.
She writes about Herman Laird from a purely sexual way.
His touches were thrilling, but she thought of him as being lower class, like a farmer, and she thought herself above that.
She has no photograph of Herman Laird. She finds a likeness in a magazine, cuts it out, and pastes it lovingly in her journal. It's an image she'll return to many times throughout her life.
Then I went to Bedeck and for the first time loved with heart and soul and sense, with everything but mind. For the first time I experienced the overwhelming power of senses, of sheer physical passion. It had never touched me before. My infatuation for Herman Laird was undoubtedly the deepest, strongest feeling I have ever experienced. It lacked only mental subjugation to be all-conquering, but that it did lack. And so I escaped. But I left something behind in that fiery furnace of temptation, and I brought something out. Passion gives and takes away.
From all the men who had passed through her life, Maud surprises perhaps even herself and chooses the Reverend Ewan MacDonald. The year was 1903, and the young Presbyterian minister had just moved to Cavendish. He watched Maud playing the organ at the church and would come religiously every evening to the post office which she and her grandmother operated. He was fascinated by Maud and soon asked for her hand in marriage. But Maud cannot leave her frail grandmother, and so the couple secretly become engaged. 5 years later, grandmother dies and Maud is free to marry. She is 36. She records the day in her journal.
I had been feeling contented all the morning. I had gone through the ceremony and the congratulations, unflustered and unregretful. And now when it was all over, I found myself sitting there by my husband's side. My husband. I felt a sudden horrible inrush of rebellion and despair. I wanted to be free. I felt like a prisoner, a hopeless prisoner. Something in me, something wild and free and untamed. Something that Ewan had not tamed, could never tame, something that did not acknowledge him as master, rose up in one frantic protest against the fetters which bound me. At that moment, if I could have torn the wedding ring from my finger and so freed myself, I would have done it. But it was too late. The realization that it was too late fell over me like a black cloud of wretchedness. I sat at that bridal feast in my white veil and orange blossoms beside the man I had married, and I was as unhappy as I've ever been in my life.
Why did she marry this man who she was not in love with? And she says that quite frankly in her journals.
She was in her late 30s, and he was 40. So they were middle-aged when they got married. And I think they both had expectations about what marriage should be, and I'm not sure that how they discussed that, but I have a feeling that they didn't, either one of them, get exactly what they bargained for.
She married him because she wanted children. She wanted to have a position in a community, and at that point, a minister was the most respected man in a community. He was very handsome. She did not know at that stage that he was going to, have the mental illness, and he was a wonderful catch.
Maud wanted a home. She wanted her own home, and she wanted to have children, and she was very clear about that. So she wanted to be mistress of a home, and she wanted children, and this was the way she could do that. I don't know what Ewan MacDonald wanted.
In terms of her career as a writer, certainly, I think it was the biggest mistake she could possibly have made. I mean, in terms of the fact that she was a woman in her late 30s, and it was 1910, and she wanted a family, it makes perfect sense. She wanted to have babies, and she had babies, and she loved her babies.
I weaned Chester today, finally. I hated to do it. It seems to me that the dearest bond between us has been broken. He is a little less my own now, and he is wearing creepers. And I cannot peep into that baby brain and discover what is hidden there. He is my child, bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh, but his little such love. I never dreamed there could be such love. It seems blent and twined with the innermost fibers of my being.
Bringing up Chester and Stuart in their Ontario home gave Maud the happiness she had craved all her life. A family of her own in a home of her own. But Maud could never have anticipated the high cost of that security.
I have never thought it a very enviable lot to marry a minister, but when I did it, I wrote 2 hours this morning and put up juice in the afternoon. I cook and sew and train my children and write novels and endless letters and run 3 societies and make innumerable parish visits and garden and advise and can berries and encourage Ewan and entertain endless callers and shop and plan menus and take snapshots.
Time to write is scarce for Lucy Maud Montgomery. Ewan is no help with the children, and although he's never read a word she wrote, her writing is now supplementing his meager income. To add to the pressures, her publisher is pushing her to fill the public demand for more and more Anne stories.
On September 1st, 1913, I began work on the 3rd Anne book. I did not want to do it. I have fought against it. But Page gave me no peace, and every week brought another letter from some reader pleading for another Anne book. So I have yielded for peace sake. It's like marrying a man to get rid of him.
By the time she reaches 40, Montgomery has penned 6 Anne books, and although she's always racing against time, she's beginning to enjoy her success as a writer. And then, in 1914, a shot is fired that triggers the onslaught of the First World War. It seems to pierce Maud's fragile world.
Good God, I cannot believe it. It must be a horrible dream. It has come up like a thundercloud. That was the shot heard around the world, to be echoed and re-echoed by the death shriek of millions and the wails of heartbroken women.
She was so intensely engaged with the First World War and the battles of the First World War that she mapped them out. She knew what was going on. She waited for the newspaper every day and for news to come. She felt that she was living through each of the battles of the war. That's very hard for people to understand nowadays.
May the 7th, a date that must ever seem of hideous import to many heartbroken people. For it was the day the Lusitania was sunk by a German submarine, and the whole world shrieked with horror and rage over the hellish deed. a deed that will brand the name of Germany with indelible infamy through generations yet born. For myself, when I read of these scores of murdered babies and pictured their dead little bodies floating about in that pitiless, ice-cold water, I felt a hideous nausea of life. I wanted to get out of a world where such a thing could happen and shake its accursed dust from my soul. Can there be a God? Can there be a God?
As a minister's wife, she had the job of visiting family after family with the news that the boy was gone, and as she took the war, although she had no sons that age, I think the war broke her spirit.
Although the war had a debilitating effect on Maud, it was not in her nature to give in to despair. She continues to do what she's always done, to write.
She writes against the war in her books in an interesting way, and she writes about it in an interesting way. Rilla of Ingleside, a wonderful book, is the only contemporary Canadian woman's account of the home front during the war. And what she gives us in that book is a perfect picture of the women managing the country when the men had to be away.
Most war stories are about on the front, but this one is about life here in Prince Edward Island, day by day, watching the news, getting news, bad news, feeling frustrated and impotent because the men were saving the empire and saving humanity was the feeling, and the losses. You know what the losses are like when you go to any of these little villages, and every village, the only monument is the cenotaph with the names of a whole generation of young men. And none of that is told in fiction.
Walter looked up at her and had one of his odd visitations of prophecy. Before this war is over, he said, or something said through his lips, every man and woman and child in Canada will feel it. You, Mary, will feel it. Feel it in your heart's core. You will weep tears of blood over it. The piper has come, and he will fight until every corner of the world has heard his awful and irresistible music. It will be years before the dance of death is over. Years, Mary. And in those years, millions of hearts will break.
The battles are over, the guns are quiet, but Maud is not celebrating. The end of the war has brought with it the realization that her husband Ewan is seriously, chronically ill.
He had bouts of mental illness, and she said at one point that if she had known that, she wouldn't have married him.
He would start speaking very, very slowly and in a very sort of childish way.
Religious melancholia is what it's called. And it means that he actually did, he was Presbyterian, and he did not believe in predestination when he was well. When he was ill, he believed that he was one of the damned.
My husband is in the throes of one of his attacks of recurrent melancholia. He is laying around the house all day, either gazing into space with a wild, haunted look in his eyes, his hair on end, his very features so changed as to make him look like a stranger to me, or chanting hymns from the hymnal in a sing-song way that makes me feel like rushing out of the house and screaming.
Nothing could, in his bouts of illness, nothing could make him feel that he was going to be saved or that the world was a place that you could be saved in. He would lose his parish if people knew about that. She had to be more and more careful. She did not want anybody to know. Her small sons would have to be exposed to their father that way. So she had to hold all of that together. Imagine what that does to you physically and spiritually and psychologically, every way you can think of. She's holding it together. She's keeping everything safe. She's keeping it under wraps. She's putting it in her journal as much as she can. But mainly she is having to keep it all inside.
No one must know, for Ewan's sake and the children's as well as my own, what his trouble is, as long as I can keep it secret.
In her journal, she marks 1919, the beginning of Ewan's illness, as the end of her happiness.
She says that in her fiction she wanted to present the sunshine. You know, she wanted to keep the shadows of her life out of her work. You know, have this like sunshiny world. I think she later regretted that and sort of got stuck in always writing cheery, upbeat books and didn't want to anymore, you know.
Today I wrote the last chapter of Will of Ingleside. It is the last of the Anne books. I am done with Anne forever. I swear it as a dark and deadly vow.
Page was pushing her to write another Anne book, as I said, even before Anne of Green Gables was published, because Page was in the serial business. And he knew that the way to make money was to you get one good book, but you sell a series. And in fact, you might even be able to sell a series. It's not so great, but people like a character and they catch on. But Anne of Green Gables was such a smash hit that he did not want to let go.
Maud wanted to write a serious novel, but was unable to break the lifetime pattern that continued to hold her back.
She has a number of contemporary writers. You think of the Canadian women writers, but you also think of Virginia Woolf, who's almost an exact contemporary.
Virginia Woolf also had a husband who took care of her and was proud of her and arranged for her to have time to write. And it really is interesting to speculate what Maud might have produced if she had been married to Leonard Woolf instead of to Ewan MacDonald.
Yes, she was in a terrible marriage, and it wasn't a supportive marriage and all of that. But on the other hand, she decided what she wrote herself. It certainly wasn't as if Ewan MacDonald was standing next to her desk saying, "You can't write about this." I mean, she picked those topics herself. And I think she didn't give herself enough credit, and I think she was afraid to look.
By 1936, her sons Chester and Stuart have grown up and left home. Ewan is no longer able to hold his post as minister in Norval. He retires and the couple move to Toronto. Maud will write 3 more books during the years she'll spend here at their new home. Ewan has been taking heavy doses of veronal, bromides, and chloral for years. He's undergone several electroshock treatments, but his condition worsens. And Maud, suffering from nervous fatigue, is also relying on medication to get her through the dreary nights at the home she calls Journey's End.
When she says, "Remember me, not as I am, but as I used to be," it's heartbreaking. What happened to Maud in those last years is so personal and so tragic. Who does want to know the true details? You know, those 2 people in that house, it was just so sad.
The truth is, I'm starving for a little companionship. For 8 weeks, I've been mewed up here without one living soul near me who is any kin whatever to the race of Joseph. Ewan, in his present quiet, dull state of mind, is rather worse than no company at all. So I'm utterly alone. And once in a while, when a dull, lifeless twilight is wrapping itself over a dull, lifeless gray world, I give up in a sort of despair and mutter, "I can't go on."
Lucy Maud Montgomery MacDonald, I think it's safe to say, was not a happy woman. But it's interesting that she was able to convince many people around her that she was happy. People who've read the journals on the island, people who knew her, people who had met her, said, "I would never have guessed. I thought she was a happy woman." That's how good her mask was.
She writes to Macmillan that she couldn't even write a letter, and the letter was a 2-paragraph letter, if she hadn't had a hypodermic. So there's something about the 2 of them sitting around that place in Toronto, on medication, depressed and unhappy. And they weren't that old. I mean, she was in her late 60s. He was maybe 70. It wasn't as if they were 90. But they were... It just... I don't know. There's something so unbearably sad about it. as if their lives had already ended.
In 1942, Lucy Maud Montgomery dies at age 67. Her body is laid in state at Green Gables. At her request, she is buried on her beloved Prince Edward Island. 1 year later, Ewan dies and is buried by her side. Montgomery left behind a detailed account of her life, an account she wrote, edited, and rewrote. She left hundreds of photographs, scrapbooks, short stories, books, and poems. But questions concerning this woman's life are still far from answered. From all these traces of a life, how much can we ever really know about this complex woman?
People are trying to piece together what Montgomery's life was like, what her feelings were like, what her context was. And it's almost impossible to do. Montgomery herself said that biography is a screaming farce. And she said, I hope no one writes my biography.
She was Anne who didn't get the happy ending, basically. She created a character who got everything she needed and really didn't get in her own life. And she was a woman in a time when women also didn't have the right to be seen and heard. I mean, let alone a child. I mean, she's got a double whammy against her. She's a woman, and she's not a beautiful woman. She's a bloody smart woman, an intelligence with a desire, and that's who she was in a time. I think she was quite ahead of her time that way, and so that fight must have been huge for recognition.
Unfortunately, we have to be content with one sort of magnificent book for kids, bits and pieces of the Emily books, and precious little else in terms of her fiction, because she wouldn't dig. And I know, I mean, this is a blasphemous thing to say about her, but what I love about her writing, I think, is so good and so important that to me it was a great tragedy that she didn't dig, because I think she could have given us so much more. But I think it's craziness to blame it on the time or on Ewan or whatever. I mean, she made a lot of terrible mistakes, but on the other hand, I think when she went off to her room alone to write, she didn't do the work she should have done. That's a sad tragedy to me about poor old L.M. She had greatness in her, but she was afraid of us.
If she was alive today, I would just tell her that we're so proud of her, that she's put her island on the map, and most of her tourists come here. They want to know where L.M. Montgomery, where she was married and where she spent a lot of her good times and some of the schools she taught in. I just wouldn't be able to really give her the exact words that I would like to, but she has. She's just made Prince Edward Island what it is today. Just sort of a fairyland.
The last 13 years of my life there were certainly not happy years, and part of them were violently unhappy. Yet there are many hours of happiness and sweetness in them, too. The happiness of a loved work and the success in that work. The happiness of wonderful communions with sea and field and wood. And I tasted this happiness again in writing over the years. There are many different happinesses, and we never know them all at once, because that would be perfect happiness, and it is something the gods do not allow us mortals.
Recently, an Anne of Green Gables manuscript thought to have vanished decades ago resurfaced in a brown paper bag. It's now in the University of Guelph's Rare Book Vault. That's our show for tonight. Here's a preview of the next Life and Times.
Let's rock this joint!
Behind the Mask.
When Jim was making nothing, he thought he was worth $20 million.
He's just a genius. He's not afraid.
I'm really lucky, man. I'm so lucky.
The Life and Times of Jim Carrey. Tuesday night at 9.